The man who made black people laugh and cry at the same time, Richard Pryor's revolution in comedy. There was a comedian who changed everything about what was possible to say on stage, who took the pain and beauty and ugliness and joy of being black in America and turned it into comedy so raw and honest that it made you laugh until you cried and then made you cry for real. Richard Pryor didn't just tell jokes. He told the truth, uncomfortable and profane and heartbreaking and hilarious, about race and poverty and addiction and family and sex and everything else that polite society said you weren't supposed to talk about. If you were black and old enough to listen to his albums in the 1970s, or if you caught snippets of his routines that your parents played after they thought you were asleep, you know that Pryor was speaking a language that felt familiar and forbidden at the same time. He was saying out loud things that black people said to each other in private, exposing the absurdity and tragedy of black life in a country that claimed to be post-racial while still treating black people like problems to be managed. He was vulnerable in ways that men, especially black men, weren't supposed to be, talking about his fears and failures and pain without shame or apology. And in doing all of this, he didn't just become the greatest comedian of his generation. He became a cultural force who influenced everyone who came after him and showed black people that their stories, in all their complexity and contradiction, deserved to be heard. Do you remember the first time you heard Richard Pryor? Maybe you were too young to fully understand what he was saying, but you heard the adults in your life laughing harder than you'd ever heard them laugh, tears streaming down their faces, doubled over with the kind of laughter that seemed to release something deep and necessary. Maybe you snuck and listened to one of his albums, That Nigger's Crazy or Bicentennial Nigger or Live on the Sunset Strip, and were shocked by the language he used, the stories he told, the way he seemed to have no filter between his thoughts and his mouth. Maybe you saw him in movies like Silver Streak or Stir Crazy and wondered how the same man who was so funny on screen could be so much more dangerous and electric on stage. Richard Pryor was born in 1940 in Peoria, Illinois, into circumstances that would have broken many people. He grew up in his grandmother's brothel, where his mother was a prostitute and his father was a pimp. He witnessed violence and abuse and degradation from an early age, saw the worst of what poverty and racism and addiction could do to people. He was sexually abused as a child, struggled in school, was kicked out of the army, and spent years trying to find his voice and his place in a world that seemed designed to destroy young black men like him. All of this pain, all of this trauma, became the raw material for his comedy. He didn't hide from his past or try to present a sanitized version of himself. He dove into the darkness and came back with stories that made people laugh and think and feel in equal measure. In the early part of his career, Pryor tried to be a respectable comedian, modeling himself after Bill Cosby, doing clean material that white audiences found acceptable and non-threatening. He appeared on variety shows and in Vegas, wearing suits and telling jokes that could have been told by anyone. But something wasn't right. He was successful by conventional standards, but he felt like a fraud, like he was betraying himself and his community by playing it safe. In 1967, he walked off stage in the middle of a performance in Las Vegas, had what some people called a nervous breakdown, and disappeared from comedy for a while. When he came back, he was different. He had decided to stop trying to be what other people wanted him to be and start being authentically himself, no matter the consequences. The Richard Pryor who emerged from that crisis was revolutionary. He started using profanity not just for shock value but as authentic expression, the way people actually talked in black communities. He tackled race head-on, not in abstract or intellectual terms, but through specific, visceral stories about encounters with racism that black people recognized immediately. He talked about the police, about white people's fear of black men, about the absurdity of trying to navigate a society that saw you as a threat just for existing. He created characters, winos and junkies and hustlers and ordinary black people trying to survive, that he inhabited completely, giving voice to people who were usually invisible or stereotyped in mainstream culture. His use of the N-word was controversial then, and remains controversial now. He used it constantly in his routines, in ways that were affectionate and angry and mocking and proud, taking a word that had been used as a weapon against Black people and wielding it himself with full knowledge of its history and power. For Black audiences, his use of the word felt like reclamation, like taking something poisonous and transforming it through context and intention. For white audiences, it was often uncomfortable, confrontational, forcing them to grapple with racism in a way that polite conversation never did. Pryor himself would later express ambivalence about his use of the word. Eventually deciding to stop using it after a trip to Africa helped him see Black people in a different context. But during the peak of his career, that word was part of his linguistic arsenal, part of how he expressed the full complexity of Black life. What made Pryor different from other comedians, even other Black comedians, was his vulnerability. He talked about his failures and insecurities and fears in ways that men, especially Black men in the hyper-masculine culture of the 1970s, just didn't do. He talked about his drug addiction, not as something glamorous or rebellious, but as a desperate attempt to escape pain he didn't know how to process. He talked about his relationship problems, his multiple marriages and divorces, his inability to sustain intimacy. He talked about his fears of white people, of police, of failure, of not being loved. He cried on stage, broke down, showed weakness and confusion and hurt. And somehow, he made all of this funny without diminishing the pain of it. This vulnerability was powerful for Black audiences, especially Black men, who rarely saw emotional honesty modeled by public figures. Pryor showed that you could be funny and hurt at the same time, that acknowledging pain didn't make you weak, that laughing at your struggles was a way of surviving them. He gave permission for Black people to be complicated, to contain contradictions, to be fucked up and still be worthy of love and laughter. He rejected the politics of respectability that said Black people had to present themselves as perfect and dignified at all times to deserve equality. He was messy and profane and damaged, and he was brilliant, and those things weren't in conflict. His storytelling ability was unmatched. He could take you on a journey through a story, building tension and detail, inhabiting different characters with distinct voices and body language, creating scenes so vivid you could see them in your mind. His routine about his heart attack, where he describes the moment of crisis and then imagines his heart talking to him, pleading for him to take better care of himself, is simultaneously one of the funniest and most moving pieces of comedy ever performed. He could make you laugh at death and addiction and despair without trivializing those things, finding the absurdity and humanity in the darkest situations. Do you remember specific Richard Pryor routines that your family quoted and referenced? The way he talked about being on fire when he was freebasing cocaine and accidentally set himself on fire, turning that near-death experience into material that was both cautionary and hilarious. The way he imitated animals, giving voice to dogs and monkeys and deer with such specificity that you recognized the truth in his characterizations. The way he portrayed white people, not with hatred, but with a kind of bemused observation of their obliviousness and fragility. These routines became part of Black cultural language, references that people made to communicate shared understanding and experience. His influence on other comedians is impossible to overstate. Eddie Murphy, who became the biggest comedian of the 1980s, openly acknowledged Pryor as his inspiration and model. Chris Rock built his career on Pryor's template of using comedy to talk about race and society with honesty and edge. Dave Chappelle has cited Pryor as the reason he became a comedian, the proof that comedy could be art and social commentary and emotional catharsis all at once. Every comedian who talks honestly about pain and struggle and identity, who refuses to sanitize their material for mainstream comfort, who uses comedy as a form of truth-telling rather than just entertainment, is walking a path that Richard Pryor cleared. But Pryor's influence extended beyond comedy. He was one of the first Black performers to have full creative control over his work, writing and producing and directing projects that expressed his vision without interference from white gatekeepers. His concert films, particularly Richard Pryor Live in Concert, 1979, and Richard Pryor Live on the Sunset Strip, 1982, were groundbreaking in their unfiltered presentation of his performances. These weren't sanitized or edited for television. They were raw and profane and uncompromising, showing Pryor at the height of his powers, and they proved that there was a huge audience for authentic black voices that weren't filtered through white sensibilities. His movies were more mixed in quality and impact. Hollywood never quite knew what to do with Richard Pryor, often casting him in roles that didn't make full use of his talents, or pairing him with white actors in buddy comedies that played it safe racially. But even in mediocre movies, Pryor's charisma and intelligence shone through. And in his best films, Lady Sings the Blues, where he played Piano Man opposite Diana Ross's Billie Holiday, Blue Collar, where he played a factory worker driven to desperation, JoJo Dancer, Your Life is Calling, which he wrote and directed based on his own life, he showed dramatic range and depth that reminded everyone he was more than just a comedian. The tragedy of Richard Pryor is that his genius was inseparable from his pain, and that pain eventually consumed him. His drug addiction, particularly to cocaine and freebasing, was well known and became part of his material, but it was also destroying him. The famous incident in 1980 when he set himself on fire while freebasing nearly killed him. He suffered severe burns over more than half his body and was hospitalized for months. Many people thought that would be the end of his career, that he wouldn't survive or wouldn't be able to perform again. But he came back, eventually returning to stand-up and movies, and he even made that horrific experience into comedy, because that was what he did. He took everything life threw at him and turned it into art. In the 1980s, Pryor was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a degenerative disease that gradually robbed him of his physical abilities and his capacity to perform. Watching him decline was heartbreaking for people who had seen him at his peak, so energetic and physical and alive on stage. The disease slowed his speech, affected his movement, eventually left him in a wheelchair. He made occasional appearances and did some work, but the Richard Pryor who had commanded stages and screens with such force was fading. He died in 2005 at the age of 65, his body worn out from a lifetime of hard living and illness. But his legacy lives on in every comedian who refuses to play it safe, in every black artist who insists on telling their truth without apology, in every person who has found healing in laughter and honesty. Pryor showed that comedy could be more than escapism or entertainment. It could be therapy, both for the performer and the audience. It could be social commentary that was more effective than speeches or essays because it went straight to the gut and the heart. It could be a form of resistance against respectability politics and sanitized narratives about black life. For black people who grew up listening to Richard Pryor, he provided something essential and rare: representation of the full complexity of black humanity. He showed that black people could be funny and tragic, strong and vulnerable, angry and loving, fucked up and brilliant, all at the same time. He showed that you didn't have to be perfect or respectable to be worthy of being heard. He showed that your pain and your struggles, the parts of yourself and your community that society wanted you to hide, could be transformed into art that mattered. His comedy albums were passed around in black communities like contraband, listened to in private or at parties, quoted and referenced until whole routines were committed to collective memory. Parents would play his albums after kids were supposed to be in bed, the sound of uncontrollable laughter drifting through the house. Teenagers would sneak listens and be shocked and thrilled by his explicit language and content. Adults would gather to watch his concert films, creating communal experiences of laughter and recognition and catharsis. The characters he created became archetypes that black people recognized and referenced. Mudbone, the old black man telling tall tales and dropping wisdom, represented a certain kind of black elder who had survived everything and could comment on it all with humor and perspective. The winos and junkies he portrayed with such specificity and humanity reminded audiences that these were real people, not just statistics or stereotypes, with interior lives and struggles that deserved recognition. His imitations of his grandmother and other family members brought to life the strong black women and complicated family dynamics that shaped so many black people's lives. Pryor's influence on black culture extended beyond comedy into language and expression. His way of talking about race and white people, his observations about black behavior and white behavior, his ability to name dynamics that everyone recognized but nobody had quite articulated. All of this became part of how Black people talked about their experiences. He gave language to things that had been understood but not named, creating a shared vocabulary for discussing race and identity. His honesty about addiction and mental health struggles was ahead of its time, particularly for a Black man in an era when admitting weakness or seeking help was seen as shameful. He talked openly about his cocaine addiction, his suicide attempts, his time in psychiatric facilities. He made this part of his comedy not to glorify it, but to process it, to find some way to live with himself and his demons. For Black people struggling with similar issues, seeing someone of Pryor's stature acknowledge these struggles without shame provided a kind of permission to acknowledge their own. The profanity in his comedy was purposeful and strategic, not just shock value. The way he used motherfucker and other curse words was musical, rhythmic, part of the authentic voice of Black vernacular speech that was rarely represented in mainstream media. For Black audiences, this language felt like home, like the way people actually talked when they weren't code switching or trying to be respectable. For white audiences, it was often shocking and uncomfortable, forcing them to confront their discomfort with authentic Black expression. His physical comedy was as important as his verbal comedy. The way he moved his body, the faces he made, the voices and mannerisms he adopted when portraying different characters, all of this added layers to his storytelling. He was like a one-man theater company, inhabiting each character fully, giving them distinct physical presences and voices. This physicality made his comedy visual and memorable, creating images that stayed with audiences long after the specific words were forgotten. Richard Pryor's impact on popular culture can be seen in how often he's cited as an influence by artists across genres. Musicians reference him, actors and directors cite him as inspiration, writers acknowledge his influence on their work. He transcended comedy to become a cultural icon, someone whose impact was felt far beyond his specific medium. He showed that a comedian could be an artist, a social commentator, a truth-teller, a voice for the voiceless. The rawness of his comedy was both his strength and his limitation in terms of mainstream acceptance. He was too real, too profane, too explicitly Black for some audiences and institutions. He never won an Emmy despite multiple nominations. The Academy Awards ignored him. Mainstream white America often viewed him with suspicion or discomfort, even as they were sometimes forced to acknowledge his genius. But he wasn't performing for their approval. He was performing his truth, and if they couldn't handle it, that was their problem. For Black comedians coming up in the 1970s and beyond, Pryor was the standard, the mountain that had to be climbed. He had shown what was possible, how far comedy could be pushed, how honest you could be on stage. He made it simultaneously easier and harder for everyone who came after. Easier because he had proven audiences wanted authenticity and truth. Harder because his talent and courage set a bar that was almost impossibly high. His multiple marriages and public relationship struggles were messy and painful, and very public. He talked about them in his comedy, trying to process and understand his patterns of self-destruction and inability to sustain intimacy. These stories resonated with audiences who had their own relationship struggles, who recognized in Pryor's honesty about his failures a kind of universal human struggle. He didn't have answers or solutions, but he had the courage to admit the problems and laugh at himself for continuing to make the same mistakes. The standing ovations he received at his performances were about more than appreciating good comedy. They were about gratitude for being seen and heard, for having someone speak truths that needed to be spoken, for the catharsis that came from laughing at pain that usually just hurt. Audiences left his shows exhausted from laughing, but also somehow lighter, having released something through that laughter that they'd been carrying. When Richard Pryor died, the tributes that poured in from across the entertainment industry testified to his impact and influence. But the most meaningful tributes probably came from ordinary Black people who remembered what his comedy had meant to them, how it had made them feel seen and understood, how it had given voice to experiences and emotions that were rarely acknowledged in public spaces. He had been their comedian, speaking to them and for them in ways that felt intimate and personal despite his fame. His legacy is complicated, like the man himself. He was a genius who was also deeply flawed, a truth-teller who sometimes lied to himself, a man who loved Black people and Black culture but was also critical of both, someone who inspired millions but couldn't always help himself. But maybe that complexity is part of why he mattered so much. He showed that you didn't have to be perfect to be important, that your struggles and failures could coexist with your brilliance, that being human meant containing contradictions. Do you remember listening to Richard Pryor albums in your house? What routines or characters of his do you still quote today? How did his honest comedy change the way you thought about being Black in America? What did it mean to have someone like Pryor speaking truths that others were afraid to say?